In the heart of ancient Africa, beyond the golden plains and the whispering forests, stood the kingdom of Obara, once a land of music and laughter, now drowned in silence. The palace that once echoed with royal drums and joyful voices had grown eerily quiet. Servants tiptoed across marble corridors, afraid to make a sound. Even the birds that nested on the palace walls seemed to sing more softly here, as if out of respect or fear. The people of Obara had learned to live with their king's silence. King Adu, a man both loved and feared, mysterious as the moon and distant as the stars. He sat upon his golden throne each morning, motionless, his eyes deep with secrets. He never spoke, not even a single word. No orders, no praise, no anger, just gestures of his hand, small nods of approval or long moments of unbroken stare that made men's hearts tremble. The ministers had grown tired of guessing his thoughts. A king who does not speak cannot rule, one of them whispered once during council, though his voice shook as if afraid the king might hear even that. Yet King Adu did rule. In his silence lay an unspoken power. He would attend the court every morning, dressed in flowing robes of white and gold, his crown shining beneath the morning sun, his face carved in stone. When disputes arose among his people, he simply lifted a hand and the guards would act. When a merchant came with gifts, the king's eyes alone decided his fate, whether to be rewarded or imprisoned. And so, over time, his silence became a law unto itself. The people began to weave stories, that he was cursed by the gods, that he had made a vow of eternal quiet, or that he simply despised his own people. Children grew up whispering his name, as if he were a ghost haunting his own palace. Then one morning, as the palace gates opened to receive new servants from distant villages, a young man named Miko stepped through. He carried nothing but a small satchel and an honest smile, two things that immediately set him apart. While the others bowed low before the guards, trembling, Miko looked around with quiet wonder. His eyes caught the marble pillars, the grand tapestries, and the silent faces of those who served within. Something about this place felt heavy, as though grief itself hung in the air. When he was led before the king for the customary greeting, Miko did what no one else dared. He looked directly at King Adu. Their eyes met for only a moment, yet that moment seemed to stretch across time. The king said nothing, as always, but there was a flicker, a shadow of surprise, perhaps, in his gaze. Miko bowed deeply then, not out of fear, but respect. In that instant, he felt something he couldn't quite name, curiosity, maybe even sorrow, hiding behind the king's quiet face. Days passed. Miko worked diligently, cleaning the corridors, serving at feasts where no laughter was heard, arranging golden dishes before a monarch who never tasted joy. Other servants warned him, never speak to the king, never meet his eyes again. He doesn't like it. But Miko was different. He was young, simple, and guided by his heart more than his fear. Every night, as the torches flickered and shadows stretched across the palace, he would watch the king from a distance. Sometimes King Adu would walk alone to the tower at the edge of the palace walls, carrying a small lantern. He would stand there for hours, unmoving, staring into the horizon. No guards, no ministers, just a lonely figure under stars. Miko wondered what kind of silence lives in a man like that. Was it pride? Was it pain? Or something much deeper? Something the world had forgotten to ask? He didn't know then, but that question would soon change both their lives forever. Ud would stand there for hours, unmoving, staring into the horizon. No guards, no ministers, just a lonely figure under the stars. Miko's curiosity grew stronger with every passing night. He could not understand why a king, surrounded by gold and power, would choose to live like a shadow. The silence of the palace began to echo in his own heart, pressing upon his thoughts like a weight. Sometimes he imagined the king speaking. What would his voice sound like? Would it be deep and commanding or soft and broken? The more he wondered, the more restless he became. Every corridor he swept, every tray he carried, seemed to lead him back to that unanswered question. Why does a king never speak? One evening, after finishing his chores, Miko sat near the courtyard fountain. The moon reflected on the water like a trembling silver coin, and the wind carried the faint hum of drums from a distant village outside the palace walls. Two older servants sat nearby, whispering stories of the king's curse. They say he once angered the gods, one said, and they took his voice in return. The other shook his head. No, no, he's not cursed. He's cruel. My cousin told me he once watched a man die and didn't say a word. Miko listened quietly, his eyes fixed on the ripples of the water. He didn't believe either story. There was something in King Adu's eyes, a hidden sorrow that no curse or cruelty could explain. Maybe, he thought to himself, his silence is not a punishment, but a wound. Days turned into weeks. Miko became known as a quiet servant who did his work well and never caused trouble. Yet, deep inside, his curiosity burned brighter than ever. He began to notice small things others ignored, how the king's hands trembled slightly when he passed a certain corridor, how he avoided a particular room near the east wing, or how he sometimes paused at the sound of children laughing outside the palace gates. There was a rhythm to the king's silence, a story hiding between those gestures and pauses. And Miko, though uneducated and simple, had the gift of noticing what others overlooked. He told himself he would not rest until he understood the secret behind the king's quiet eyes. One night, while carrying a tray of food to the royal dining hall, Miko saw King Adu walking slowly toward the same tower again. It was late. The palace had fallen asleep, and only the distant torches flickered against the stone walls. Miko hesitated, his heart pounding, then decided to follow. His footsteps were light, his breath shallow. The corridor seemed endless, filled with the soft rustle of the king's robe and the echo of Miko's heartbeat. When they reached the tower stairs, Miko hid behind a pillar, watching silently. King Adu climbed to the top, placed his lantern on a small table, and knelt before something, a small framed picture glimmering in the candlelight. For a moment, the world itself seemed to stop. The king's shoulders shook, and tears slipped down his face. Miko's chest tightened. He had never imagined that silence could cry. The king reached out, touched the picture gently, and whispered something, or maybe it was only a breath, too soft to hear. Then he wiped his tears and stood still, facing the stars. Miko's mind raced. Who was in that picture? Why did the king cry for her? Fear told him to leave, but compassion rooted his feet to the ground. For the first time, he saw not a king, but father, broken by something too painful to name. When the king finally left the tower, Miko stepped forward, drawn by an invisible force. The picture still rested on the table. It was a small painting of a young girl with bright eyes and braided hair, smiling as if life had never known sorrow. The name beneath it read, Adina. Miko stared at the name until his vision blurred with tears. He felt the weight of the king's loneliness fall upon him like a wave. That night, as he returned to his quarters, sleep refused to come. Every image in his mind, the trembling hands, the distant gaze, the tears in the tower, pieced together a puzzle only half complete. Somewhere within this palace lay the story of that little girl, and the reason why the king had buried his voice along with her memory. Miko knew, from that moment, that he would not only serve his king, he would seek to understand him. For an understanding, he felt, there might be a way to bring peace to both their hearts. The next morning, he woke with only one thought, to find out the truth. The following day, Miko slipped into the royal library, a massive chamber filled with dust, ancient scrolls, and forgotten books. Few dared enter it. Even the chief scribe visited rarely, as the king himself had not set foot there in years. The air smelled of parchment and time. As Miko searched through the shelves, he found a small, leather-bound diary tucked behind a stack of royal records. It was worn, the ink faded, the seal bearing the royal crest of Obara. His hands trembled as he opened it. Inside were entries written in a careful hand, the handwriting of King Adu himself. The first few pages spoke of prosperity, of peace in the kingdom, of his joy as a young ruler. But then, as the entries moved forward, the tone changed. The words grew heavier, darker. One line caught Miko's eye. She laughed today. Her laughter fills every corner of my heart. And a few pages later, another. They came at night. The fire, her scream. I called her name, but my voice broke before it reached her. Miko felt a chill run down his spine as the story unfolded. He read on, how enemies had attacked the palace during a rebellion, how the king's daughter, Princess Adina, had been caught in the chaos, How King Adu had tried to reach her, but failed. The diary ended with a single line, ink smudged by what could only be tears. The gods gave me a voice, but I could not use it to save her. From this day, I bury my words with her. Miko's eyes blurred with tears. He closed the diary and held it to his chest, feeling as if he had just touched the beating heart of a tragedy too great for words. The silence that had ruled Obara for years was not a curse. It was mourning. It was a man's punishment to himself, a vow of eternal quiet born from unbearable loss. As the sun dipped behind the palace walls, painting the sky with the color of dying fire, Miko walked slowly toward the tower again. He stood before the same small picture and whispered, "Your father never forgot you." His voice cracked under the weight of the truth. He wanted to tell the king what he'd read, to somehow ease that pain, but he knew that some wounds must be approached with care. That night, he returned to his quarters with the diary hidden beneath his robe, guarding it as if it were the kingdom's greatest treasure. He couldn't sleep, but for the first time, he understood the silence. It was not emptiness. It was full of echoes, echoes of a father's love, trapped in a kingdom that had forgotten how to listen. The next morning, the palace stirred with its usual quiet rhythm. Servants moving like shadows, ministers walking with their heads low. Miko approached the throne room carrying the diary, his hands trembling. King Adu sat on his golden seat, surrounded by courtiers who spoke in half-whispers. When Miko entered, the king's gaze fixed upon him, calm but piercing. Miko knelt, lifted the diary, and placed it at the king's feet. "Your Majesty," he said softly, "I know your secret. I've seen your pain." The room fell into stunned silence. No one had ever spoken to the king so directly, let alone about his silence. Guards stepped forward, but the king raised a hand to stop them. For a long time, their eyes locked, the servants full of empathy, the king's full of old sorrow. Then, slowly, King Adu reached for the diary. His fingers brushed against the leather, and he froze. The hall seemed to hold its breath. The ministers exchanged fearful glances, uncertain whether to intervene. The king opened the diary and turned its pages. When he reached the last entry, his hand began to shake. The same tears that had fallen years ago now glistened anew. Miko lowered his head, whispering, "You don't have to carry this alone." For a moment, the silence broke, not with sound, but with feeling. The air was thick with grief, forgiveness, and something fragile. Hope. The king stood up slowly. His crown glimmered faintly in the afternoon light. He looked at Miko, and for the first time there was softness in his eyes, a kind of wordless gratitude. He didn't speak. He simply placed his hand on Miko's shoulder. That touch said more than any sentence could. Miko felt tears sting his eyes. The room, once a tomb of unspoken pain, now held a small pulse of life again. The guards bowed, unsure why, but sensing that something sacred had just happened. And as Miko walked out of the throne room, he knew one thing for certain. This was not the end of the story. The king's silence had been understood, but it had not yet been healed. There was still one final step left, the step from grief to forgiveness, from silence to voice. That night, the tower's lantern burned brighter than usual, and though King Adu uttered no words, the stars above Obara seemed to shimmer a little closer, as if they too had been waiting for this quiet confession. The next dawn broke like a sigh after a long night, slow, golden, and unsure. The palace, usually wrapped in the stillness of obedience, felt alive with whispers that carried both curiosity and disbelief. Servants who had never dared to raise their eyes now spoke in murmurs of what they had seen, how the silent king had touched the servant boy's shoulder, how the air in the throne room had trembled with something like peace. Miko, still trembling from the encounter, wandered through the palace courtyard, his thoughts heavy yet full of light. The morning breeze carried the scent of jasmine and dust, and every petal that fell seemed to tell him that something deep within Obara was changing. But change, he knew, never came without pain. He looked toward the tower where the king had once wept, the place where Adana's picture still rested like a shrine of memory. He wondered if the king had gone there again in the night, and whether his silence had felt any lighter. Miko's heart ached to see the ruler freed from his sorrow, not as a servant longing for favor, but as a son who wished to see a father smile again. That afternoon, When the sun stood high and poured molten light across the marble floor, a sudden sound broke through the palace. The ringing of the old council bell. It was the first time it had been struck in years. The guards gathered. Ministers hurried through the halls, and the people outside the gates pressed forward in confusion. King Adu had summoned the entire court. Miko stood at the edge of the room, his heart pounding as the king entered. His presence was commanding yet softer now, as though the years of silence had finally found meaning. He sat upon the throne, the diary resting open beside him. "Bring the servant forward," one minister called. But before Miko could move, the king raised his hand and motioned for everyone to be still. Then he stood, tall, regal, trembling slightly, and turned to face his people. The hall grew so quiet that even the torches seemed to hold their flame still. Every face turned toward him. Every breath waited. For a moment, Miko thought he would remain silent as always. But then, impossibly, the king opened his mouth. His voice came out like a whisper cracked by time, fragile yet beautiful. "For years," he said, the words scraping their way into the air, "I buried my voice because I thought my silence could keep her memory alive." Gasps rippled through the hall. Some cried openly. Others fell to their knees, stunned. The sound of the king's voice, hoarse, human, trembling, felt like a miracle. But, he continued, tears streaming down his cheeks, my silence only deepened the darkness. It built walls where there should have been light. His words hung heavy in the air. "Today, I break that vow. For my daughter, for my people, for my soul." And as those final words left his lips, the kingdom of Obara, silent for nearly a decade, erupted in weeping, applause, and prayers. The days that followed became legend. The bells that had been rusted with years of quiet were cleaned and rung again. Children laughed in the courtyards. Music returned to the streets. The king began to walk among his people, listening, speaking, even smiling. Miko stayed by his side, not as a servant, but as a companion, a witness to rebirth. Together, they restored the gardens, reopened the schools, and built a memorial for Princess Adina at the foot of the tower. On the day it was unveiled, the entire kingdom gathered. The memorial was simple, a white stone carved with her name and the words, "Her laughter taught us to speak again." King Adu placed a single lily on the stone and turned to the crowd. "Forgiveness," he said, his voice stronger now, "is not forgetting. It is learning to live with memory and still choosing to love." The people bowed, many weeping openly. Miko watched him, pride swelling in his chest. The man who had once lived as a ghost of grief was now a beacon of peace. That night, as the stars shimmered above Obara, Miko returned to the tower alone. The lantern still burned there, casting soft light on Adina's picture. He stood before it and whispered, "Your father spoke today. The kingdom heard him, and they remembered you." As the flame flickered, he could almost swear the air shimmered with warmth, as if the lost child herself smiled in gratitude. He left the tower quietly, knowing that silence would never again rule this kingdom, not while there were voices brave enough to speak for the broken. And as he walked into moonlight, he understood the true meaning of his journey, that even in the deepest silence, one act of compassion could awaken an entire world. Through the air, faint, uncertain, yet unlike anything the kingdom had heard in years, it was the sound of a voice, hoarse, trembling, and human. Every head turned toward the balcony of the throne hall. There stood King Adu, his face lifted toward the light, his hand resting on the golden rail. For a moment, the people below could not believe what they were witnessing. The king was speaking. His voice, cracked with years of silence, carried across the courtyard like a fragile prayer. "My people," he began, each word a struggle, each breath a resurrection. "Forgive me for my silence. I thought I honored her by burying my words. But I see now I buried all of you too." The courtyard fell still, not out of fear, but awe. Servants dropped their tools. Guards froze mid-step. Ministers lowered their heads. And Miko, standing near the steps, felt his throat tighten as tears blurred his sight. King Adu continued, his voice gaining strength like a river finding its course again. "My daughter's laughter once filled this palace. When she was gone, I believed silence would keep her close. but it only built a wall between us and the world she loved. Today, I break that wall. Today, I choose to speak again, not as a king, but as a man who has learned that grief cannot be worshipped, only lived through. His words carried like wind across every hall, through every open window, stirring the dust of years gone by. The people who once feared him now looked upon him with compassion. In that moment, Obar became alive again. Bells that had long been rusted in their towers began to ring, hesitant at first, then wildly, joyfully. The sound spread across the capital like sunlight across morning mist. It was as if the kingdom itself was breathing for the first time in a generation. Later that evening, as the stars blinked awake above the palace, Miko stood once more at the tower where everything had begun. The picture of Adina still glowed softly in the candlelight, but beside it now lay something new, a single white flower, placed there by the king himself. Miko bowed his head, whispering, "She'd be proud of you." A soft breeze moved through the tower, carrying a warmth that felt almost like a reply. When he turned, he found King Adu standing at the doorway, no longer cloaked in the weight of silence, but dressed in quiet dignity. "You helped me remember her laughter," the king said softly, his voice still rough but steady. "You reminded me that love never dies when it's spoken." Miko's eyes welled with tears. He bowed deeply, but the king placed a hand beneath his chin, lifting his face. "From this day," Adu said, "you will no longer serve in silence. You will serve beside me, not as a servant, but as the keeper of truth." In the days that followed, the kingdom transformed. The courtyards once empty, now filled with music and laughter. Children ran through the streets, echoing the joy that had been lost in years of mourning. The silence that had once ruled Obara was replaced by stories. Stories of courage, loss, forgiveness, and hope. And through it all, Miko remained by the king's side, not as a boy of low birth, but as a reminder that compassion could heal even the deepest wound. Whenever the king spoke to his people, his voice carried both strength and tenderness, shaped by the memory of what had been lost. And when he ended each address, he always looked toward the horizon where the sun dipped low and whispered her name, Adina, because some loves, he had learned, were never meant to fade. They were meant to echo, through silence, through pain, through time itself. And in those echoes, the kingdom of Obara finally found its peace.